He didn't lower his voice. He didn't even pretend to. Finn Oduya had been standing 2 feet away, notepad in hand, when the man in the charcoal suit leaned toward his colleague and said it, in German, clear and unhurried, that the busboy looked like he'd be more comfortable sweeping floors than working in a place like this. The colleague laughed. Finn wrote down the drink order and walked back toward the service station without a word. That was how it always started at Harborview. Not with a slur, not with something you could report. Just a comment made in a language the speakers assumed no one around them understood. A small, private cruelty disguised as conversation. Finn had learned to let it pass. He'd had a lot of practice. Harborview Restaurant sat on the edge of Halifax Harbor, the kind of place where the chairs cost more than most people's monthly rent, and the menu changed with the tides. It had been open for 11 years, earned 2 national dining awards, and maintained a wait list for weekend reservations that stretched to 3 months. The clientele were old money Maritimes, Toronto business travelers, the occasional federal minister up from Ottawa on a working dinner, people who expected a certain kind of invisible, a staff that moved through the room like air, present and gone before you noticed. Finn had worked there for 4 years. He was 31, though he looked younger, which he'd been told wasn't always an asset in the industry. His father was Nigerian-Canadian, his mother from a small town outside Münster, Germany. He had his father's build, lean, deliberate, and his mother's tendency to go still when something needed thinking through. He'd grown up bilingual without effort, added French in school, picked up Mandarin during 2 years in Vancouver, and somewhere along the way collected enough Arabic and Portuguese to navigate a conversation, though he'd be the first to say he wasn't fluent in either. None of that was on his resume for Harborview. The application had asked for hospitality experience and food safety certification. He'd provided both. The manager who hired him, a careful woman named Christine, now retired, had asked him during the interview what he considered his greatest professional strength. He'd said, "I listen well." She'd nodded like that was exactly the right answer. It was. Table 12 that evening had 4 guests. Finn had clocked them the moment they walked in. He clocked everyone, it was reflex, and noted the dynamic within the first 30 seconds. 2 men anchoring the table, one in his mid-50s, with the quiet authority of someone who'd stopped needing to prove himself 20 years ago, the other younger and visibly performing confidence. A woman beside the younger man who checked her phone twice before sitting down, and the man in the charcoal suit whose name Finn would later learn was Werner Brandt. Brandt was German, from Hamburg originally, now living between Frankfurt and Toronto. He ran the North American operations of a shipping logistics company that had been quietly buying up port infrastructure along the eastern seaboard for the past decade. He had an excellent tailor and a habit of speaking about people as though they weren't in the room, even when they were. The older man across from him was a Halifax investor named Douglas Alcott, who owned, among other things, a significant share of the warehouse district that Brandt's company had been trying to acquire for 2 years. They were, as far as Finn could tell, in the middle of a negotiation. Finn wasn't supposed to know that, but he listened well. The first comment had come 20 minutes into the meal. Finn had returned to the table with the wine, a 2019 Burgundy that Brandt had ordered without looking at this list, naming the vineyard and the vintage like a man accustomed to being confirmed rather than corrected. Finn had confirmed it without expression, located the bottle, checked the temperature, and brought it to the table. As he was pouring, Brandt had said something to the younger man beside him, in German, low but not quiet, about how the wine would probably be wasted on the locals who couldn't tell Burgundy from a box. Finn filled the glass evenly, set the bottle down, moved to the next glass. The younger man had glanced at Finn with the faint embarrassment of someone who knew enough to feel uncomfortable, but not enough to say anything. Brandt didn't glance at anyone. He picked up his glass, swirled it once, and looked out toward the harbor. Finn returned to the service station and made a note about the wine pairing. He didn't tell anyone. There was nothing to tell, not really. A man had said something unpleasant in a language he believed no one nearby spoke. It happened. Finn had grown up with a German mother and a father whose accent people had mimicked to his face at job sites when he was a young man trying to build something in a city that wasn't always sure what to do with him. Finn understood the geometry of that particular cruelty, the way it required a witness who couldn't respond to function as a performance. He understood it. He just didn't perform his reaction for them. The meal continued. Brant ordered the halibut. His colleague ordered the beef. The woman on his right ate very little and said less. Douglas Alcott, the Halifax investor, was gracious in the deliberate way of men who'd learned that graciousness was a negotiating tool. Warm enough to make you feel welcomed, measured enough to remind you he was watching. Finn refilled water glasses, adjusted the table setting after the first course was cleared, answered a question about the dessert menu with specifics. He was good at his job in the way that gets noticed by the people who notice things and it goes invisible to everyone else. At one point, Brant's colleague, whose name was Tobias, Finn gathered from the conversation, excused himself from the table, and Brant took out his phone, typing something quickly. Then he put it away and looked around the room with the slight boredom of a man waiting for the next act. His eyes landed on Finn for a moment. Then he said to Alcott, in English, "How long has this restaurant been open?" 11 years, Alcott said. "One of the best in the city." Brant made a sound that might have been approval. Then, a beat later, when Finn moved to refill the water on Brant's side of the table, Brant turned to Alcott and said, switching to German without breaking stride, that he wondered sometimes how these places managed to stay open when they hired people who clearly had no business being in a fine dining room. Alcott didn't speak German. He smiled politely at something that must have sounded like small talk. Finn set the water pitcher down on its stand. He pulled out his notepad. He said, in German, without looking up from the page, "Was kann ich Ihnen noch bringen?" What else can I bring you? The table went silent in the particular way that rooms go silent when something has shifted, and no one is sure yet what it means. Brant turned slowly. For a moment, he said nothing. The confidence he carried so habitually, the ease of a man who had been able to say whatever he wanted in rooms like this for years, went somewhere he couldn't find quickly. "Entschuldigung?" he said. "Pardon?" Finn looked up then, unhurried. "Ich fragte nur," he said. "Falls Sie noch etwas benötigen?" I was only asking, in case you needed anything. He didn't add anything else. He didn't need to. What happened in the next 60 seconds was the kind of thing that doesn't unfold dramatically. There was no outburst, no accusation delivered to the table, no moment where Brant threw his napkin down and stormed out. The reality was smaller and in its own way more complete than any of that. Brant looked at Finn for a long moment. Then he looked at his colleague, who had returned to the table just in time to catch the tail end of the exchange, and was now sitting very still. Then Brant looked at Douglas Alcott, the man he had spent 2 years trying to close a deal with, the man whose goodwill he needed, the man who had brought him to this specific restaurant on this specific evening because he trusted it and trusted the people in it. Alcott was watching Brant with an expression that had not quite finished deciding what it was. "My apologies," Brant said in English, to Finn. Finn nodded once. "Of course. Take your time with the menu." He walked back toward the service station. He had been hired at Harborview, not through any particular ambition toward fine dining, but because the job had been there, and the money had been steady, and he had needed, at 27, something steady. His path up to that point had been the kind that people describe charitably as non-linear and describe honestly as hard. His father, Emmanuel Oduya, he kept his father's name after his parents divorced when Finn was 9, had come to Canada in 1986 with an engineering degree from a university in Lagos that Canadian employers spent years declining to recognize. He'd worked construction, then project management, and eventually built a small civil contracting firm in Halifax that did solid work and paid its people on time. He was not a man who complained. He was also not a man who pretended things were other than they were. And when Finn was old enough, he sat him down and told him plainly, you're going to have to be twice as prepared as the man next to you. And you're going to have to be quieter about it. And that's not fair, but it's what's true. His mother, Inge, had taught secondary school French in Dartmouth for 30 years. She had come to Canada for love and stayed for the winters, or so she said when pressed, in a way that made it clear she was not entirely joking. She had spoken German at home with Finn as a matter of course, not to give him an advantage, just because it was her language and children grew into the languages they were given. Finn had grown into several. He hadn't studied languages formally after secondary school. He'd learned French properly in school, then improved it working summers in Montreal at his uncle's cafe. Mandarin had come during 2 years in Vancouver, where he'd lived in an apartment building where half the residents were recent immigrants from Guangdong, and the other half were students from the mainland, and where the easiest way to build any kind of community was to learn enough of the language to be a real neighbor. He'd done that. He was good at it. Not because he was exceptional, he would say, but because he paid attention. Because he listened. He was, at Harborview, simply a server. That was the whole of what the guests knew. The kitchen at Harborview was run by a chef named Ross, who had been there 7 years, and who had, over that time, developed an unusually precise sense for the moods of the dining room. He could tell from the pace of ticket flow and the energy in a server's walk whether a table was going well or sideways. He'd learned not to ask unnecessary questions. That night, after Finn cleared the main course from table 12 and came through the kitchen pass with 4 plates, Ross looked at him once and said, "You good?" "Yes," Finn said. Ross nodded and said nothing else. That was the entirety of the conversation, and it was enough. The dessert course came and went. Brant said almost nothing for the remainder of the meal. His colleague, Tobias, spoke more than usual, filling the silence with observations about the restaurant, the Harborview, a wine trip he'd taken to the Okanagan the previous summer. Douglas Alcott listened and responded, and steered the conversation with the practiced ease of someone who had been in rooms like this a long time. Once, toward the end of the evening, Alcott caught Finn's eye and gave a small nod. Not a nod of performance or solidarity, just the acknowledgement of one professional to another. Finn brought the bill without being asked. 3 weeks later, Finn was called into a brief meeting with the restaurant's owner, a woman named Patricia Faulkner, who had opened Harborview in her mid-40s after 20 years in hotel management, and who ran the place with the unshowy precision of someone who had seen every possible way a service business could go wrong and had committed to preventing them systematically. She did not have a reputation for wasted conversation. She told him she'd received a call from Douglas Alcott. Alcott had a portfolio of investments across several sectors, including, it turned out, a hospitality group that was in the early stages of developing a boutique hotel property on the South Shore. He was looking for someone to help establish the food and beverage program, not to run the kitchen, but to run the room. To understand service, culture, language, the particular intelligence required to make a space feel like it belonged to its guests without losing itself. He had asked Faulkner if she would be willing to part with Finn for that conversation. Faulkner told Finn this in the same tone she used to discuss inventory. Then she told him that she would not stand in his way if he was interested, but that she would very much appreciate knowing his decision within the week, because she'd need to adjust the floor schedule. Finn sat with that for a moment. "Was there anything else?" he asked. Faulkner smiled, which was unusual enough to register. Apparently, Mr. Alcott mentioned that he'd been impressed by the handling of a situation at the table. He didn't specify. She looked at him steadily. He said, "The right person was already in the room. I just didn't know it yet." Finn looked out through the window at the harbor. The light was flat and gray, the way Halifax gets in November, the kind of gray that people from elsewhere complain about and locals have long made their peace with. "I'll let you know by Thursday," he said. He thought about his father later that night, sitting in his apartment with a cup of tea going cold on the counter. He thought about the years his father had spent building something in a city that had required him to prove himself repeatedly and quietly, The way Emmanuel had never described it as unfair, only as what's true. He thought about his mother speaking German to him at the kitchen table in Dartmouth, as though it were the most natural thing in the world, which it was. He thought about Werner Brandt, who had spent an evening saying things in a language he assumed was a shield, and who had discovered, slowly, without spectacle, that it wasn't. There had been no confrontation, no moment where Finn had stood up and demanded to be seen. He hadn't needed to. He had simply been present and competent and fluent in more things than the man across the table had bothered to consider. His father had told him once, "The quiet ones are always the most dangerous in a negotiation, because the loud ones spend all their time letting you know what they know, and the quiet ones are busy finding out what you don't." Finn had thought at the time that his father was talking about business. He was, in a way, but he was also talking about something else, about the particular kind of patience required to move through a world that constantly underestimates you, and the discipline to let the underestimation be someone else's problem. The tea had gone cold. He finished it anyway. Werner Brandt's company did not acquire the Halifax warehouse district. Whether that was related to the dinner at Harborview, or to the general shape of the negotiation, or to Douglas Alcott's reading of the man across the table, no one said directly. These things rarely get explained. They just resolve in one direction or another, and the people involved move on. Finn met with Alcott's team the following month. The conversation went longer than scheduled, and Finn found himself talking not just about service concepts and staffing structures, but about the kind of place a hotel could be, the feeling a room could have, the difference between a space that performed welcome and one that actually practiced it. At one point, the woman leading the interview, a sharp-eyed director of development named Simone, who had very clearly already made up her mind about several things and was merely confirming them, asked Finn directly, "Why hospitality? You could have done a lot of other things." Finn thought about it. "I like being in the room," he said. "I like that the room tells you things if you pay attention." She wrote something down. He got the position. He still worked weekends at Harborview for another 6 months, finishing out the season, which was partly loyalty and partly because he was not the kind of person who left things unfinished. Ross, the chef, gave him a bottle of Burgundy on his last shift. Not a special occasion bottle, just a good one. The kind you open on a Tuesday, because Tuesdays deserve it too. "Don't let them make you loud," Ross said, which was cryptic enough that Finn laughed. He knew what it meant. The guests who had moved through Harborview's dining room over 4 years had looked at Finn and seen the role, not the person. Most of them. Some had been worse than others. A few had been genuinely kind. All of them, in the end, had received the same quality of service. Unhurried, precise, attentive, regardless of what they brought to the table. That was the job. But it was also something else. It was the thing his father had taught him without ever framing it as a lesson. How you carry yourself in a room where no one expects much from you is one of the purest tests of character there is. Werner Brandt had sat in that room and spoken freely. Finn Oduya had stood in it and listened. Only one of them had understood what the room was for. What do you think it takes to stay composed in a moment like that, when you have every right to respond and you choose instead to wait for the right moment? Is that strength, or is it something we ask of people who shouldn't have to prove themselves at all?